So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Kerry Bevan and I'm the subject lead for secondary languages at Cardiff Met, and I'm joined today by Emma Oduha, who's the subject lead for secondary drama, and we are a merry band of three, and our colleague Sian Wickersham is unable to join us today as she is teaching, and we are also ably supported by the Cardiff Partnership team, and Rachel Newby is working furiously behind the scenes to ensure that you have access to the materials and that you all get the support that you need.
Okay, so a warm welcome to you all, everybody. My name's Emma Oduha and I'm joining Kerry this afternoon. So just to give you a heads up before we get going, we've got some future professional learning that we just want to flag up to you that's coming up down the line. So obviously here we are at the start of, or the end of September, beginning of October. For those of you who are welcoming clinical practice to BA primary student teachers to your schools soon, we've got a bespoke session coming up for you tomorrow afternoon. That's for senior mentors and mentors. That's online via Teams. We're obviously here in our final of our autumn professional learning for mentors and senior mentors. However, for mentors on the PGCE programs, we've got some top tip sessions that are coming up, and they will align with the times when you're going to be doing the main sort of forms of assessment of your student teachers. So we've got top tips for learning and teaching observations coming up in October and November for progress reviews. And for those of you who are mentors of BA primary student teachers, you've got a top tip session coming up in November. How are you doing, Kerry? Those slides looking all right for you, or do you want me to carry on?
Yeah, I think I'm okay. I think yeah, some gremlins in the background as usual. Thank you, Emma.
No
Thanks
worries.
ever so much. So if we just start by sharing our priorities for the forthcoming academic year, we have 3 priorities. And the first priority is around sharing and reflecting upon the vision of how student teachers learn. Cardiff Partnership's IT programmes have just been re-accredited, you'll be pleased to know, by the Education Workforce Council, and new accreditation criteria were published as part of the process. The criteria specified the need for all ITE providers to articulate their vision of how student teachers learn. So in co-construction with school colleagues, we constructed the vision of how student teachers learn within the Cardiff Partnership. And we'll be explaining more about that in a moment. The second of our priorities is based on analysis of mentor and senior mentor evaluation from the last academic year, where research and inquiry were identified as areas of clinical practice which were in need of further guidance and support. And the final priority is around mentoring conversations, which we'll explore in more detail later. But again, student teacher evaluative data and research indicate that quality mentoring conversations have the potential to positively impact the development of teaching practice. The professional learning will include discussion points and activities and resources aimed at unpicking the importance of that for our student teachers later on in this session. So if we just share with you our aims for today. So we're going to start with some updates within the partnership, and then we're going to begin with sharing our vision, our co-constructed vision of how student teachers learn. And then we'll move on to consider how the vision is enacted and facilitated during clinical practice, focusing specifically on those other 2 priorities that I've just mentioned, research and inquiry and mentoring conversations. So if we begin with the updates, we've all been busily working on creating some new mentoring resources to support you. And these are available in the clinical practice guide. Emma did put up a link to those at the start of the session, but we'll continue to post those, and those are available on our Cardiff Partnership channel. So there's a new appendix in the clinical practice guide, and it's aimed at supporting mentors specifically with observation and feedback. And it also gives you a quick and easy to use crib sheet with prompt questions to guide mentor conversations. And then we've tidied up the mentoring channel, and it's been streamlined for you. There's also this year a new policy around the concern over attendance, and your university link tutor will be helping your senior mentor if there are areas around attendance and maybe poor attendance. That's an area that we noticed there was a little loophole last year, so we've just tidied up the policy on that. And Emma's going to I'm going to hand over now to Emma, who's just going to show you our new channel.
Thanks, Kerry. Can you just stay unmuted for a minute and just let me know when you can see my other screen?
I will. Yep, I can, Emma.
Marvelous. Okay, so here I am in Teams. I'm in the browser version, and just make sure that that's the case for you. You can see I'm in the Cardiff Partnership Team site, and we've got a channel entitled Mentors and S Mentors, and then you've got some tabs along the top here. And if you go to the one entitled Mentors and Senior Mentors, you'll see that it just looks a little bit like a web page with 5 simple blocks. Kerry mentioned earlier on that the clinical practice guides, and they're all available there for you to access. All of the professional learning that you've attended this autumn term is accessible under that professional learning tile. Anything that we produce that helps you assess your student teachers, so when we do the top tip sessions, all the materials will go under the assessing student teachers tile. If you want to go to our YouTube channels, we've got 2 major channels, one for CP Mentors, which has got a load of really great resources in there, including some 2 minutes about videos about various different aspects of your provision as a mentor, but also the video recordings of these professional learning sessions will be accessible there. And finally, a tile for senior mentors, which doesn't concern you as a mentor, but you might want to have a little nose in there if you want to. So hopefully we've tried to tidy that up a little bit, make that accessible. If you've got any issues accessing that, then do be sure to contact us at Cardiff Met on that ite@cardiffmet.ac.uk email address. So going to hand back over to Kerry now with some additional updates.
Thank you, Emma. So the next update we need to inform you around is around the QE process. For those of you who have been with us before, you'll know that in previous iterations, the focus has been on planning. This has been altered this year, and the focus will be around mentoring conversations. But again, rest assured that support will be on its way via the university tutor at the point that needs to kick in. But it is important to say that focus is changing. And the final thing to tell you about is just some evaluation and something to celebrate. So we are incredibly grateful for all the work that you do. We know how many hours, in addition to the 1 hour weekly mentor meeting that's on your timetable, that you put in. And just to say that this is actually recognised by the student teachers. So 95% of student teachers in the last academic year said that their support and guidance from their mentors was good or excellent. And 95% of student teachers said the opportunities to engage in dialogue with their mentor to support their professional development was good or excellent. So there's a huge round of applause to you all to celebrate the wonderful work that's already going on within the partnership. So today's professional learning is just about building upon that and taking it even to the next level. Where can we go next? And aspiration is definitely the word that we're looking at today. So if we start with our first priority, which is the vision of how student teachers learn. If you remember, we talked about being co-constructed with our stakeholders. It wasn't just imposed. Cardiff Met didn't just come upon this idea. As a starting point, just for sense, I suppose, of familiarity, if nothing else, we thought we'd share the infographic, which many of you may well be familiar with, and that is schools as learning organisations. And it emphasises different types of knowledge that schools are encouraged to draw upon and to generate in order to achieve the 4 purposes, which, as you know, is right at the core of the infographic. So if we think about the value of inquiry, that knowledge is generated by teacher inquiry, and that is going on in your schools already. The research and inquiry culture of innovation and exploration to drive forward standards in our schools. We have an importance of knowledge collection and exchange. So the understanding that knowledge development is ongoing and dynamic. It's a cumulative process. We have the significance of collaboration to ongoing professional learning. So this schools as learning organisation model is just here to, I suppose, to highlight and to re-emphasise the importance of the professional qualities that underpin our own profession. So when we move a little bit further down to what we're going to drill into today, what we aspire for our student teachers isn't completely pie in the sky. It is actually rooted in the expectations of qualified practitioners, and the qualities and the practices that are going on in schools. Those are what we want our student teachers to be able to do by the end of this course as they move into the start of their teaching careers. So I did say that maybe it all might sound a little bit pie in the sky, but aspiration is definitely the name of the game. And we know that we acknowledge that the student teachers are not the final article, but we do want to set high standards, and we do want them to reach up to the sky and become critically reflective and challenge. The partnership model that we have, the research informed, the clinical practice model that we have, is not a model of apprenticeship. It's not a model that many of us might not be familiar with. It might not be the model that we used when we trained. We might have been more in the model of mentor do and I copy, I imitate my mentor, but that's definitely not the model that we're looking at here. So in our research informed clinical practice model within the partnership, student teachers learning is characterised by an iterative process of clinical reasoning. Now, for those of us who were here last year, we did touch upon clinical reasoning last year. If you're new to the partnership, don't worry. At the back of the clinical practice guide, there is a crib sheet on clinical reasoning, which will help you understand the approach that we're taking with our student teachers. But just to sort of try and break it down a little bit. So clinical reasoning, so student teachers need to use reflective thinking and awareness of their own thought processes to make decisions about their practice. We need to encourage them to draw from different forms of knowledge. We need them to think about thinking. We need them to think all the time, and to understand that teaching is also not just an active process, it's actually a metacognitive process. And through clinical reasoning, we encourage reciprocal and respectful professional dialogue between the mentor and the student teachers, where student teachers are encouraged to challenge personal assumptions, perhaps adopt a more critical orientation towards improving their teaching. So that's what we're thinking about. And it's based upon the following principles: that dialogue is built around questions. So this, as I said, this is respectful and reciprocal questioning. The second point is the challenging of personal assumptions and preconceptions in how student teachers learn. Student teachers have a wealth of knowledge and backgrounds and experiences, and they may come with personal assumptions about what good or bad teaching is or isn't. They may have preconceived ideas about certain aspects of teaching, maybe based on something they did that didn't work, or maybe again based on prior experience. And it's this the part of clinical reasoning is where we challenge, the mentors challenge these personal assumptions. Clinical reasoning is also based on the trialing of ideas, based on the interrogation and integration of different forms of knowledge, you know, the different types of knowledge that we have. And again, we'll look a bit deeper into that in a second. And finally, it's based upon careful analysis and evaluation of evidence to inform judgments. So if a student teacher makes a decision about why a particular aspect of their teaching is or isn't going well, are they able to use actual evidence to support their judgments and not just say, it doesn't work or I'm not doing it. So with those 4 aspects in mind, we just like you to perhaps have some audience participation now. And we'd like you to consider the following question, first of all. What approaches do you currently take that encourage these learning characteristics? And if we take, for example, it may feel, again, a little bit aspirational, a little bit pie in the sky, but if we take, for example, group teaching, and a student teacher has a bad experience of group teaching and decides that they no longer want to do any group teaching in their lessons, how are you as mentors going to use these aspects, these different question points? How are we going to challenge them? How are we going to have dialogue that will encourage them to further their practice? And I'll give you a few moments to reflect upon that. And if you'd like to put some answers in the chat, that will be fantastic. And that's just one example. Thank you. Yes, so you could help the students to break down the lesson and analyse what aspects they feel didn't go so well. Absolutely. Thank you, Anne-Hara. Do you reassure that sometimes lessons don't go to plan? Yeah. Great. Hannah, thank you. Find out the reason it was difficult or why it didn't work. Yeah. Exactly. So engaging in that dialogue. Yeah. Ask what they thought went well and what they felt didn't. Brilliant. Thank you. And then perhaps ask them for the evidence of that. You know, why do they feel the way they do? Do they actually have evidence that group work didn't, what evidence do they have? Thank you, Louise. Indeed. Yeah, share some examples of how assumptions you had as a teacher have changed. Indeed. And I'm sure all of us are constantly evolving and changing, and the student teacher that we were maybe last year, maybe 10 years, maybe more years ago, has definitely evolved. So thank you for those contributions, indeed. So it's thinking about the student teacher and how through dialogue, through challenge, through integrating different types of knowledge, integrating perhaps the knowledge that they already have, perhaps any sort of scholarly knowledge they have, integrating the knowledge that they've had from observing, both you and the learners and other teachers within your school, and also encouraging them to make actually informative judgments, evaluate their judgments, and not just say it didn't work, but actually give some evidence to support that judgment. So if we just now explore this vision, and again, I don't want you to be too overwhelmed, but if we start with the student teacher is the visible part. That's the part that you see. Student teacher, you see them planning, you see them teaching, and you see them evaluating. And that is absolutely what you do. You see the practice, I suppose. And what we want just to remind you is the part that I've just mentioned, is that teaching is not just practice, it's not just doing, it is actually a cognitive process. And to remind you to reflect upon perhaps the invisible parts that contribute to the knowledge that have allowed the student teacher to teach and plan and evaluate. So I'm just going to sort of go round the centre there. And if we look at intellectual knowledge, well, that may well be intellectual knowledge from academic papers that you may have directed them to, or we may have directed them to. It may be around theory, learning theories, behaviour theories, but it also might be intellectual knowledge they've gained within your school. You might have a research champion. You may well be conducting an MPEP. You might be involved in embedding research and inquiry. That also is part of the intellectual knowledge, the invisible knowledge that will contribute to how the student teachers plan and teach and evaluate. If we move clockwise around the circle, we have knowledge about learners. So student teachers enhance their practice by prioritising knowledge about their learners. They need to understand who their learners are in order to be able to plan. They need to prioritize knowledge about their behavior, knowledge about progress, about ability, about achievements. And that really helps them to tailor their lesson planning and their teaching to actually create a positive learning environment. Moving further round, we have knowledge gained through teaching. And as we know, student teachers develop experiential knowledge as they engage in the actual process of delivering lessons. And through that, they integrate other forms of knowledge. The act of teaching is a dynamic process that allows student teachers to observe the immediate impact of their instructional decisions. We also have professional practical knowledge, and that is perhaps where you see perhaps more visibility. This is the knowledge, the knowledge that you contribute, the wisdom that you have, that you share with your student teachers. It provides the student teachers, your knowledge provides them with access to your tacit knowledge. What they see when they sit and observe is often a seamless, amazingly professional and polished lesson. What they don't see is all the decisions that you've made during that lesson, perhaps to change, to address low-level disruption, to move children, to adapt your task. And all of that are things that you will share, your wisdom you will share with your mentee through your sort of weekly mentor meetings and in informal discussions as well. Personal knowledge and identity, as we move further around the circle, we've looked at this in another professional learning session, is based on the fact that they are adult learners and they come with a wealth of knowledge themselves and a wealth of beliefs. And they have shaped and will continue to shape their teaching and learning journeys. It may be that they have, master's qualifications, PhD qualifications, but they might have been teaching assistants. They might have other experiences that will contribute to the journey that they will go on. And they also will be integrated into the practice that they will do, and they will continue to show throughout the year. And the final one is the knowledge gained through indirect practical learning. And that perhaps as mentors is the one perhaps we may struggle with. We worry that our student teachers are just not teaching enough. They're not active enough. But actually, this knowledge that they gain through really meaningful conversations, through targeted observations, through professional discussion, not just with you, with other colleagues around the school, with their learners as well, that's really important in informing the student teacher and how they plan, teach and evaluate. I'm going to hand over now to Emma for the next session.
Thanks, Kerry. Okay, and I guess that sort of indirect knowledge that the student teachers develop can often happen during the all-important research and inquiry time. So we're going to have a little look now and take a deep dive into research and inquiry. I think it's probably worth mentioning to all of you that having looked at evaluation data from mentors, senior mentors and student teachers for the last academic year and over the last few academic years, we've noticed that research and inquiry is going to take a bit of time to get our heads around as teacher educators. It's got a bit of an image problem, and I guess some of the data is pointing towards the fact that research and inquiry can pull our student teachers away from the classroom. And for some student teachers, mentors, teacher educators more broadly, that can feel a little bit counterproductive, a little bit counterintuitive. And so we want to take some time to do some activities with you all, just to think about how we can encourage student teachers to make the most productive and proactive use of their research and inquiry time, so that it does have a bearing, it does have an impact on their developing practice, and that hopefully it's something that both of you, the pair of you as mentor and mentee, can be the beneficiaries of. So as Kerry said a moment ago, a little bit of audience participation now. I'd like you to take a moment to think about research and inquiry, and we're going to have a think first of all about the positives of research and inquiry. So for you, what kind of value does it have to your practice? Think about how maybe research and inquiry has helped you pedagogically within the classroom and within your wider role. Can you think of a time when research and inquiry has impacted on your practice for the better, or even to help you really sort of understand what's going on better? And then secondly, what is its value to your school and the sort of broader community of learners that you serve? Are there projects going on in your school? Are there approaches that are research informed that are going on in your school? Are you part of a cluster project that has got a sort of research and inquiry focus? And then thinking back then to the novice and student teachers, maybe NQTs that you've worked with, that you're working with now, that you've worked with in the past, to what extent can R&E add value to them and for them? So if you wanted to take a moment and maybe number your responses in the chat, don't have to answer all of them in the chat, but if you've got something to say, then maybe put a number that it refers to and pop it in the chat. Thank you. Okay, we've got a great contribution already from Corey at St David's. Thank you for that. Research and inquiry is good for understanding what works well in other classes and adopting this into your own practice. And if we go back to the infographic that Kerry was introducing us to earlier on, it's that sort of translation and integration. We sort of go through a process as practitioners of seeing what's going on and what's working well in other classes, and then translating that into practice based on the knowledge that we have of our own learners, of our own subject disciplines or AOLEs or pedagogical approaches and what we're trying to achieve. Someone from St Julian's here, Elle Hitchman, thank you. It's good for the school because you can share best practice and make links across AOLEs. I can't agree with that more. One of the absolute benefits of our role as university tutors is that we get to see lots of different subject disciplines, and in the primary phase lots of different AOLEs, so lots of different practice. And I must say I've learned a great deal, not only from the subject disciplines and settings and phases, but from student teachers actually, at seeing practice in lots of different contexts. I'm glad that you've raised that. Louise Hall says it gives you some dedicated time to consider different ways of doing things and strategies that can create impact. Absolutely. I suppose that it's kind of good for our well-being in some ways, although it can be difficult to prioritize that time, but to have those fresh ideas can really make you feel quite good about, you know, where you go next. Louise also says it makes the delivery of teaching relevant to what is happening in the world and the challenges and impact today's students. Yes, it makes it relevant. It probably hasn't passed people by. There was a very detailed ITV news report on children's reading that came out at the end of last week that really sort of put the emphasis on the need for us to be looking to research to inform our practice, to sort of stay up to date with the best of what we know, the best of what has been found through research about what can really give us our best bets really for impacting pupil progress, well-being, you name it. So thank you for that contribution. We've got Sian here saying that it can support wider targets. Yes, absolutely. We make this point to student teachers a lot, that their assignments are designed to feed into that, to support school development plans and evaluative reports that, you know, produce your priorities. We've got someone from Whitmore here saying, I've just completed the MA. Hurrah! Well done. It helped me deepen my understanding of my pupils and what they bring with them into the classroom. Attitudes, family beliefs, backgrounds. It can sort of pull us out and sort of rise us up above the classroom a little bit, put our head above the parapet a bit and sort of look around and think about the sort of wider issues that are playing out in our classroom practice, and give us some time to understand them. Someone from Blackbrook Primary here saying sharing good practice across the school. How empowering to sort of feel part of that wider community of support you know, that we're not just siloed in our own classrooms, that we can really work together to crack some of these issues that are really pertinent to our own contexts. Sean says it allows students to triangulate professional discussions with research. Yes, that theory into practice, and then reflect again once they've acted upon their findings. Yeah, it's kind of cyclical from Sean's point there. Really, really great contribution. Thank you. And then someone from Blackwood Primary here. Achieving a shared understanding of effective practice, engaging experiences, role of enabling adult to support adults. Yeah, it can sort of allow you the time to really acknowledge and understand what other people in the school, other roles in the school are doing for young people in their learning, to really sort of make the most of those relationships of other classroom practitioners too. And then Anwen has made a point here about challenge. So much out there. Do students need directing to relevant research specific AOLEs? Now, yes, it's a nice segue there, actually, Anwen. Yes, this is a challenge for the novice and early career teachers, and they are going to need some extra support. So that sort of leads me on to my next couple of questions, and I think you've alluded to that there. For you, what are the challenges that you encounter? If you're a mentor who has been working with us for a few years now, that we've had research and inquiry built into student teachers' time, what challenges do you face when you're supporting your student teachers in research and inquiry? And then, as Anwen has alluded to here, for the student teachers themselves, they've got this research and inquiry time built into their timetable. What challenges do they face in making best use of it? So I'm just going to mute myself now and allow you to put some thoughts in the chat. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Sean. So we've got student teachers can sometimes lack focus. It is important to have discussions with the student to sometimes guide or support those lines of inquiry. Absolutely. And I guess it sort of chimes with Anwen's point that there's so much out there, and also there's so much that they could be focusing on in their practice, that sometimes they really need that guidance, either to point them towards relevant sources or to help them find a target that they can use their research and inquiry time to address. We've got someone from Oakfield Primary School here who says the research needs to be relevant and used in class. Absolutely. So it's got to have that practical application, and sometimes certain sources can make that really easy, such as the teaching walkthroughs by Sherrington and Cavaglioli. They're really sort of close to practice. We can see how the research has been sort of translated in those sorts of texts into practical applications. But on occasion, the student teacher will need support in sort of translating what they're reading into practice. I'm really curious to know if there are any challenges that you as mentors face. We've got a couple of points there about how the students can find research and inquiry time quite challenging, but we're also keen to know if there's anything that you find particularly frustrating or challenging when you're trying to support your student teachers with research and inquiry time. I guess the lack of focus is a challenge and a frustration there, but if there's anything else that we can think of as we're going through, it would be useful to add that so that people don't feel that they're alone, because this certainly did come through as a theme in the evaluations for mentors and senior mentors and student teachers this year. So I'm going to allow you to sort of keep adding those thoughts to the chat now. I'm going to move on to do some sort of clarification around what we mean by research and inquiry and what we're talking about when we're talking about research and inquiry on our programmes. And we've got a nice quote here that I'll just give you a moment to read from our research and inquiry strategy, which tries to sort of explain what inquiry for teacher practitioners is. So just a moment for you to read that to yourself. Okay, and just to pull out a couple of threads here before I turn to the chat again, because I can see we've got two great contributions there. Something to emphasize coming through in this quotation is that it is actually intended to be close to practice. There's an emphasis in that first paragraph of it being about sort of investigating or exploring your own practice and your learners' learning. It's got to be something that is going to be meaningful to the practice going on in your context. And then secondly, this idea that evidence is used to achieve improvement. So it should have a clear sort of practically relevant purpose. So this sort of close to practice nature of research and inquiry is what we're trying to emphasize and focus on with student teachers. It's not something that sort of take them up into the ether, into the abstract. It's got to be something that helps them with their sort of day-to-day development as a teacher. So really interesting point in the chat here from A. Williams at Whitmore. Before the MA, I wouldn't necessarily have known where to point them for journal articles, etc. And I guess, you know, that is, we've got a real sort of, we'll have a real variety of experience with research and inquiry across the piece when it comes to mentors in the partnership. And I would say myself, I certainly wasn't working at master's level in my sort of second, third, fourth year in the classroom. It took for me to start an MA qualification for me to feel a bit more confident about how to access and use and translate academic literature. But I guess, you know, that's the beauty of being within a school now as a learning organisation. So perhaps you've got members of staff within the school that might be able to support you as a mentor in making reading recommendations. You've got Link University tutors linked to your school, so you don't have to be sort of alone in all of this. And you certainly don't have to feel that as a mentor you have to be able to recommend academic literature to be able to support your student teachers in research and inquiry, and hopefully we'll give you some more ideas on that in a moment. We've got Sean here saying, I feel sometimes students lack understanding that R&E is not just reading articles outside of the classroom. It's about lesson observation, book looks, professional discussions. Yes, I'm really glad that you've mentioned that sort of broader umbrella and the sort of practices and approaches that sit underneath research and inquiry that you can prescribe as a mentor to student teachers, encourage them to do, and Kerry firmly agrees. And actually this quotation, timely, helps to sort of support that. So this says that R&E is trying to bring many types of knowledge to bear on student teachers teaching so that they develop their practice. And we looked at the different types of knowledge when we looked at the vision of student teachers learning earlier on. Activities undertaken in research and inquiry time should draw upon a blend of sources of knowledge. So this is not just written sources based on research, but as Sian said in the chat, it's also practical sources like sending them to do some observation or encouraging them to do some focused observation of your practice. Team planning and teaching, if there's an aspect of their practice or their pedagogy that they're really struggling with and you're not convinced that they're really able to do that on their own independently when they're planning, then perhaps you'll encourage them to do some team planning and teaching with you so you can better understand what the issue is there. And you can also model your thought process. You can sort of give them access to that practical knowledge that's guiding your decisions. Maybe they need to practice small chunks of lessons. Maybe you need to get them, you know, coming and doing an aspect of a lesson and doing it multiple times and then reflecting on it. Perhaps they're struggling to get the class in and settled, you know, that entry routine. Maybe they're struggling with that. Maybe you therefore get them to practice their practice and do that with a couple of lessons and then get them to reflect on it afterwards. Conversations with more experienced colleagues. Perhaps you need to point them in the direction of a colleague that's got expertise, knowledge, skills in a particular area, and it'd be worth them using that research and inquiry time to go and have that professional learning conversation. And then just to remember that R&E is not intended to be separate from improving teaching. It should contribute to student teacher development in the classroom, and we're going to dig into that now via a task. So what we've got here is one of the professional learning standard elements. So we've got PL1, wider reading and research findings. And this is one of the critical elements of the standards. For those of you who have mentored for some time with us now, you'll know that the standards in yellow are the 10 critical elements, and they're the ones that we expect student teachers to progress in at a faster rate than some of the others. So here we've got the QTS descriptor, which states that the teacher demonstrates an increasingly confident understanding of the theories and research about assessment, pedagogy, child and adolescent development, and learning relevant to planning and day-to-day practice. And I suppose it's really emphasised in that descriptor, isn't it, that actually the theories should be relevant to their planning and day-to-day practice. So if this is what we're expecting them to be capable of doing, so to reach capable by the end of their PGCE or BA programme, then we need to start thinking about, well, what does that actually look like? What do student teachers who are at the unaware phase in this particular element of the standards, what might their practice look like? And in turn, what are the implications for our mentoring practice, for your mentoring practice? So if you've got a student teacher who is unaware in this particular standard, what kind of approaches are you going to take in guiding them and supporting them in research and inquiry to address this particular element? So what I'd like you to do, please, is to just take a little screen grab, and I'm going to do the same and pop it in the chat. Take a screen grab of the descriptors that you've got there on the screen. Let's just do a quick copy of that and I'll pop it in the chat as well. Okay, that's coming into the chat now for you. And I'd like you to consider those two questions. So for a student teacher who is unaware, what is that going to look like for this particular element of the standards? If they're aware, what is that going to look like? How will they look different? How is their practice and how are their sort of dispositions, behaviours going to be different? When they reach capable, which is the point at which we award qualified teacher status, what do they look like? What does their practice look like with regard to this particular element of the standards? So perhaps if we just focus on that first question first, and perhaps, you know, you could put unaware in the chat and maybe use some sort of descriptions about what that might look like with regard to this element versus capable and QTS plus. Pop some thoughts on that in the chat, and then we'll start to think about the implications that this might have for our mentoring practice. Okay, take some thinking, this one. So we've got someone from Whitmore here saying that a student teacher in this particular element of the standards who is at capable, and if we just flick across to this slide here so we can see what we're talking about when we're looking at capable: mainly impactful, mainly embedded, mainly rigorous. So this colleague is saying that we would see evidence of research brought into the mentor meetings. Yes, research for written assignments within their teaching methods and within their self-evaluation in their PLP. Yes, so we're seeing at this point that it's mainly embedded and it's coming through in the sort of practical aspects that we are visible to us and are unearthed through professional dialogue between mentor and mentee. So I wonder then, if that's what we're looking at, if we've got a student teacher who at capable is really able to demonstrate how it's impacting their practice, we can see it, it's referenced or it's discussed, there's evidence of it, what does that look like at aware? And look at that, as if by magic, Corey has added some thoughts there. So perhaps at aware, and when we're looking at aware, they're developing, there's some impact. Corey says that students who have found research or strategies and are curious to ask how you think they can incorporate them into the sessions. Yes, really, really shrewd move there. You've picked up on this sort of this student teacher at aware as being someone who needs support and needs that help to think about how they might translate that particular research or that particular strategy that they've seen or that they've observed within their R&E time, how they're going to incorporate it into their lessons. And I wonder there, given Corey's suggestion of what that might look like, what the implications might be. You know, do you as a mentor help them and guide them, or if you're trying to get them to sort of move from aware to capable, what kind of approach would you make as a mentor if you're trying to get them more independent, more able to translate that theory into practice? We've got someone from St Julian's, Elle Hitchman, here saying that aware they might be doing some reading but are not engaging with it critically or be able to consider how it links to their practice. So we've unearthed a bit of a gap here that needs to be bridged from aware to capable, where this sort of translation process might need to be supported. So I'm going to come back and thank you very, very much for those 3 contributions. That's really helped to sort of unpick this particular element of the standards. And I think using those descriptors from unaware, aware, capable to QTS plus, we can start to sort of think about all of the elements of the standards and how they might look for student teachers and how it might work in terms of their behaviours. But what are the implications for our mentoring practice? So let's go back to Corey's example. If we've got a student teacher who's found research strategies, they found them, they're curious, and now they're coming to you and they're asking, well, what do I do? How do I incorporate? I've found some really interesting reading on a questioning technique, but I'm not really sure how to use it, where to start. What approach do you take? What do you do as a mentor in that instance, particularly if you're hoping that your student is going to start to become a bit more independent? You're trying to move them into a place where they're not so dependent on you in thinking about how they put that into practice. Let's have some thoughts in the chat, or by all means, feel free to unmute yourself and to come in for us all to hear. How would we support that particular student? Really nice suggestion. Yes, absolutely. Perhaps, as Louise said, you might show them a scheme of work and ask how those questions could be applied. Perhaps it might be to a particular lesson that they're about to teach, get them thinking about the learning intentions of that particular question and how the questions and the questioning technique might support the learners in achieving that learning intention. But indeed, as Louise says, sort of over time, oh, there we go, we've got it, or get them to watch a lesson, or this is nice, get them to watch a lesson and suggest what questions could be asked. That's a really nice idea. I like that. So, you know, you're really sort of putting the emphasis on encouraging them to translate that knowledge, to sort of integrate that knowledge with maybe things that they've already seen, observed. Hannah says, show them where to use it in the timetable. Ask where they think they can use it. Absolutely. So again, we've got this sort of dialogue that's informed by questions that links back to our vision of student teachers learning. David says, potentially give them a range of options and get them to discuss the benefits of each so that they can make the final decision themselves. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really nice idea. And what you've got the benefit of being able to do is to make contextually relevant recommendations, or to ask questions that are really relevant to where that particular student teacher is at in their practice. So you might say to them, right, okay, let's think back to a lesson that you taught last week and I gave you feedback on, and I asked you, you know, about the sort of questions that you were asking the learners and whether they were effective in helping you check for understanding. Now that you've done that reading, what would you ask this time around? Or if you were to teach that lesson again, what would you do differently? You've got the benefit of knowing that student teacher, knowing what's happened, knowing where they're going, knowing what's coming next. So you can sort of intervene and encourage them to translate theory into practice in a much more authentic way than we at university are able to do. You're really at the sort of chalk face of bringing to life that theory into practice in a meaningful way for those student teachers. Okay, I'm just going to pause and just take a little moment to think about QTS Plus then. So what if you've got a student teacher who is flying, or what if you've got a student teacher who's on the cusp from capable to QTS Plus? What approaches might you take there if you've got someone that is, let's go back to the example from M. Hill at Whitmore. So someone who, you know, we can see the evidence of research brought into mentor meetings. They're, you know, they're researching for their written assignments. They're really switched on to all of that. But then what about, you know, what about somebody that we really need to push, that we want to encourage to be even more rigorous, to fully embedded, to have a strong impact? Is there anything that you can think of that you might do with that type of student teachers to really push them forward beyond capable? Just take a moment for thoughts on that in the chat. I wonder if here, whilst we're waiting for some thoughts to come in on this, we might consider research and inquiry opportunities that are going on in the school, and how we might connect our student teachers with existing research and inquiry initiatives that are going on. So I wonder if, for mentors out there wondering how they can really push on and challenge some of the exceptional student teachers that we sometimes work with in a PGCE or BA primary context, that we might just start to think about, you know, what can I point them towards, either within my own school, or if you're secondary, within your own subject association, if you've got things going on more broadly within your subject discipline, if you're in primary, within the sort of broader pedagogical community of education, that you might encourage them to start to go beyond and start to feed into broader initiatives going on within the school. So just before I hand over to Kerry to have a look at the last section of this professional learning, I'd like you to just reflect on two scenarios here, just to sort of consolidate what we've been talking about with regard to research and inquiry. And I invite you to consider both of these, but to just maybe comment on the one that you think you know how you might be able to support or how you might be able to help. So first of all, imagine a student teacher is unsure how to make the best of R&E time, and you're concerned as a mentor that it's pulling them away from the classroom and not impacting on their classroom practice. What would you do to support them in that instance? Or you have a student teacher who's struggling with an aspect of their pedagogy. Say, for example, they're really struggling to refocus learners who are disengaged or who are off task in lessons. You want them to make productive use of their R&E time to address this issue. So how can you help? So just the last couple of minutes now to think about those two scenarios, put a number, and tell us how you would support or how you would help as a mentor for one of those. Okay, we've got a great idea here from Ella. Thank you for that. You might encourage them to use the R&E time to create a positive relationship with a disengaged learner. I wonder if it might be, you know, useful to get them to do a little bit of a pupil trail, to closely observe that learner in different contexts, to start to understand what particular issues they're facing. Really nice ideas flooding in here. Sam at Malpas says, support them by offering other members of staff in the school to observe, depending on what more practice support they need. Yeah, absolutely. So you can be a sort of, you know, that mediator, that person that really helps to bring them into the wider community. It can be quite scary for a new student coming into your context to approach another member of staff, or to even have the knowledge of who to go to. So you can really help sort of broker that relationship and support them in that vein. I've got someone from Oakfield Primary School here saying send them to other classes to see what works. Brilliant. Yeah, and just giving them permission to actually do that can be very helpful. Thanks, Josh. Ask what they think isn't working for them with regard to the issue they're struggling with. Yes, that dialogic approach. Demonstrate how you could effectively do it during one of your own lessons, but also direct them to another colleague who does it brilliantly before talking through again. Yeah, it's that cycle, isn't it? Go off, observe, reflect, come back, tell me what you found. right, tell me what the consequences are for your own practice. And when he is saying, I'd ask the student to complete a pupil trail, great, with the class or group of learners they're particularly struggling with, ask them to note any techniques that have worked effectively. So they're really sort of focusing their attention there on what it is that they're trying to develop and what the needs of the learners are. I've got someone from Glanarvon Primary here saying, go and visit other teachers. This is a real great emphasis on, get out of the classroom and see others to pick up some tips on how to engage the learners. And I really like this point here from somebody at Whitmore saying, set weekly targets or a timeline to keep them focused. Now, this is important, and organise them to observe, because there's sort of an accountability angle here, isn't there? That, how do we know that they did it? And how do they know that they are able to act on it and that they have acted on it? So we've got to really try to encourage them to sort of follow up on that and show us how they've embedded it. We've got Kerry here saying, send them to observe this in another lesson to see the responses to other teacher strategies. Yeah, we've got a lot of focus on this, which is a great suggestion. And then someone from St Julian saying, help them draw up a plan for R&E. Yes. Now, this might be something that you would do with a student teacher who is unaware. Think about how they can chunk their timetable, their R&E time, rather than seeing it as that unstructured time they don't know what to do with. I'd absolutely encourage you to do something like that with a student teacher who's at the unaware stage. Some really great ideas. Thank you very much to all of you. Now, we're not going to have time to have a listen to this today, but just note, and I'm going to put a link to this in the chat. We spoke to a very experienced mentor and senior mentor and now ITE coordinator at Stanwell School in Penarth, Lauren Rees. She's a languages teacher, but she's got a lot of expertise and experience as a mentor, but also working as a senior mentor. And it's just a very short sort of 7-minute extract that you'll find when you go back to look over these professional learning materials, and a longer episode that I put in the chat where she talks about how she supports student teachers and also how she supports mentors to help student teachers with research and inquiry. So I'd urge you to have a listen to that if you get the opportunity to. And the last things to think about when you're trying to achieve this with your student teacher, and we've covered a lot of this ground in this section, is to consider the learning needs and abilities of that student teacher in front of you. If they need some more structured time, think about what Elle Hitchman from St Julian said. Maybe help them to use that time more productively. Support the student to focus their R&E activity on a pedagogical dilemma or a practice-related target. The weekly mentor meeting encourages you to get them to reflect on how they use their R&E time and how they're going to use their R&E time going forward to address pedagogical dilemmas or practice-related targets. Prescribe or encourage them to identify the most appropriate activity to complete in their R&E time. All of you almost unanimously said that for that previous scenario, it was get out into other classrooms and understand what's going on with this learner or learners and see some other practice and report back to me. Encourage them to reflect on and prepare to share their findings and the practical implications. Make them accountable. Get them to think about that so what phase of the reflective cycle. Follow up with them and make them accountable during the mentor meetings. And it might be that if it's a particular practical strategy, ask them to highlight it in their lesson plans. If they're going to be sort of putting into practice what they found or what they intend to do based on their R&E time, then maybe they could highlight that to you, emphasize it in a lesson plan or lesson plans that they've got coming up the following week, and guide that integration of knowledge from research and inquiry through questioning. Direct them to identify and commit to those next steps. And now I'm just going to hand over to Kerry, but just to remind you that you've got more on this in our Clinical Practice Mentors YouTube channel. Got 2 minutes about R&E. We got research and inquiry playlist. We've got a whole appendix in the Clinical Practice Guide called Research and Inquiry Explained. And in the PGCE guide, we've got guidance on how you can support your student teachers in their university assignments. You're not on your own with that. And then, of course, some more podcast episodes for you to dip into about research and inquiry more broadly. Kerry, I've stolen a bit of your time there. Hopefully, we'll be able to do mentoring conversations now in the last 20 minutes.
Diolch yn fawr, Emma, thank you. So now we're just going to focus on the last section, the final of our priorities for this academic year, and that's around mentoring conversations. And I mentioned earlier on that this is going to be the focus, our QE focus for this academic year, but we also know the importance of these mentoring conversations and how much the conversations you have with your student teachers, how much they make a difference. So with that in mind, how are we going to make the most of feedback conversations? So we've highlighted 4 research-informed approaches to mentor feedback and to the types of conversations that we have with our students. The first approach is a mentor-led one. It does what it says on the tin. Strengths and areas for development are provided by the mentor. The second approach is around metacognitive conversations. It involves thinking and saying things out loud. It involves the student being encouraged to unpick their learning and teaching intention. So what they perhaps wrote down on their lesson plan versus actually what happened in reality, getting them to think and say it aloud. The third approach is the delayed feedback conversation, where in certain scenarios, it may not be appropriate, and I'm going to get you to reflect upon that in a minute. It may not be appropriate to give immediate feedback. And it may be that you choose based on the student teacher in front of you and the emotions that are being presented, you may choose to delay that feedback. And the final of our approaches is around clinical reasoning. And I mentioned earlier that if you were with us last year, this was something we discussed in depth. And if you're new to us, you will find information towards the end of the clinical practice guide. There's a section with a crib sheet and an explanation around clinical reasoning, where the mentor is using clinical reasoning conversation to promote critical reflection, this reciprocal and respectful conversation and dialogue and inquiry with their student teacher. So 4 different approaches, and I know you've been so wonderful already in your participation this evening, but we'd just like a little bit more audience participation. And I'd like you to reflect upon when and why you might use these approaches. And again, perhaps you could just number 1 is at a particular point, and you might be thinking of the STEEL descriptors, and you might be thinking of aware or unaware or capable or QTS plus, or you might have specific examples of when you think these might be necessary or they might be appropriate. It might be at different points in the clinical practice, in the actual placement. So I'll give you a few moments if you could just label them 1, 2, 3, 4, and perhaps think when and why you might use these approaches. I'll just mute myself for a second. Great, thank you, Corey. So mentor-led might be during the student teacher, the CAT review, to discuss strengths and next steps. Indeed. So you might be leading that. The mentor might be leading that conversation. Thank you. Thank you. So Glanad Avon Primary. So the final one might be before and during their progress review. Indeed. So encouraging some clinical reasoning. Oh, thank you. So number 3, it is difficult. I think this is difficult because I think you've identified it, that this whole process, so doing a PGCE or doing the BA over 3 years, it is emotionally draining, it is overwhelming. We haven't talked about student teacher identity, but the idea of them being a novice, so having to be a learner, but at the same time, they are in charge and responsible for classes where they're called Miss or Sir, Madame, whatever. And that actually causes it to be emotionally overwhelming for them. And for some student teachers, you can see it, you can visibly see it, that they are not able to receive feedback immediately following a lesson observation. And in that scenario, it might well be appropriate to ask, first of all, the student teacher if they would like some time to reflect, and perhaps discuss the lesson observation later on. It might also be that your student teacher would like to receive their written or the feedback in writing to allow them to absorb the information and to process what's being said before a conversation can take place. But it's understanding the different needs of each student teacher, that they're not all the same, and we can't all just take a one style approach to delivering mentor feedback. Thank you. So Josh, depending on the relationship you have with the student teacher, 1 and 2, yeah, it could be as frequent as necessary. Indeed. Indeed, and you'd want to suggest caution. Yes, indeed. You don't want to be always directing the conversation, but at times it may be in order at the very start when they are unaware. It may well be that you have to structure that feedback conversation. They don't know what they don't know, and therefore you have to guide that, but allowing them fairly quickly to unpick that and to actually to have metacognitive conversations around what's happened in the lesson, to unpick their practice, to discuss aspects of pedagogy. Definitely. Thank you, Josh. So what we really would like you, and it is about bearing in mind the learning needs of your student teacher. It's about bearing in mind, you know, how feedback actually plays out on them. For some, we know that feedback is absolutely scary, and it paralyzes them. And for others, it drives them on to greater things. So it's understanding how they respond to feedback and adapting our conversational approach accordingly. It's understanding where they are in their journey and how they're progressing. And it's understanding the purpose and the contextual application of the approach and what is necessary at what particular time. I'm just going to read the chat here for a second. Louise, can you picture approach number 3 as an opportunity to demonstrate an evidence for their development of skills in reflection? So they understand that you're both using it so that they understand you are both using it as a strategy. I think so, definitely, Louise. Could it even be for them to reflect upon some research they did? Yeah, absolutely. So that delayed opportunity might be that, you know, you give them something, you give them some written feedback, or you go away and say, you know, could you just, before we meet again, why don't you just consider perhaps the learning observation that you did on X teacher and their strategies around low level disruption, and how that might feed back into the conversation that you then have. So they've sort of gone away and done some sort of reflection prior to that conversation that you have. Thank you ever so much, Louise, and thank you to all those excellent contributions in the chat. So in order to support you as we move into this focus for this academic year, you will find, you'll be fortunate to know that there is guidance in the clinical practice guide. So for PGCE, we're looking at Appendix 4, and in the BA, we're looking at Appendix 2, and that's around guidance for mentors supporting student teachers in planning. And the observation and feedback guidance is Appendix 7 of the PGCE and Appendix 4 of the BA Clinical Practice Guide. And on a separate note, but it does form part of this conversation, is students this year are receiving training on peer coaching. And this is the second year that we're trying to integrate this as part of our programme at Cardiff Met. So we're hoping that you might reap the benefits of this in the conversations as we move forward through the academic year. I'm just going to hand back now to Emma for the final section.
Diolch, Kerry. And can I just echo what Kerry said? After a very long day of teaching, and particularly the fact that it's a Monday, your engagement in the chat has been really great. I particularly like, if we just circle back to Louise's previous point about this idea that you get them to reflect and feedback before our voices become part of that process, yeah, before you as the mentor sort of put your spin on it, because you're hoping for that student to just sort of develop their own individual professional identity and voice as a teacher. Really like the way you've worded that there. Okay, so let's bring this into land then. So some next steps for you to consider, because of course within an hour and a half of your precious time, it's always difficult to cover everything in full. So we would urge you to go back to the clinical practice guide, which has got the vision of how student teachers learn in full. So it'd be really great if you could give that a read, so that you know what our aspirations for student teachers learning are, and how you can sort of play your part as a mentor, as that sort of first point of contact really in their learning and development. So consider it and think about how you can implement strategies that support its enactment. Secondly, we've got a wealth of resources out there to support you in your practice with research and inquiry. So we'd encourage you to have a look at them. We've tried our best to make them really accessible and also quite short, because we know that your time is precious. So we've got a lot of that we've already shared with you today that you can access on our YouTube channel and in the clinical practice guide. And think about, as we've sort of started to unpick in this session, how you will tailor your practice to the needs of your student teacher during CP1 and CP2. And then finally, to consider your approaches to mentoring conversations. We are, as Kerry said at the start of this professional learning, going to be asking you when we come out to do the quality enhancement visits, what kind of approaches that you use, what further professional learning you might need to develop your practice in this area. I wonder if it might also be useful to get together, if you're a new mentor, with a more experienced mentor in your school, to talk to them or to maybe even observe them structuring feedback and providing feedback, or using a particular approach with student teachers in your school. Remember that you don't have to be alone in that role. There are other student teachers on placement in your schools, and therefore other mentors for you to network with in order to develop your practice. So before we go, just to flag up to you that we have got some other sessions coming up down the line that will be recorded if you can't make them synchronously. Top tips for learning and teaching observations, and top tips for progress reviews. We've got those dates coming up. And then finally, we would like to ask you to just spend less than 5 minutes of your time completing this very, very short evaluative survey about the professional learning. We're always trying to sort of improve the professional learning that we offer to you, and to find out if there's anything else that you want, that you need to really help you in your role as a mentor.